Everyone in Coldwater Hollow thought Marabelle had finally snapped. In the middle of an August heat wave, she began filling her cabin with greasy sheep wool. Not blankets, not yarn, raw fleece, whole bales of it. Dense, yellowed, barn-smelling wool that left oil on her hands and dust in her throat. Then she started buying firewood by the truckload. Tamarack, birch, split fir, anything dry enough to burn hot. She stacked it against the outside walls of her house until her little cabin looked less like a home and more like a bunker made for some old frontier war. Her sister begged her to stop. Her neighbor laughed at her. The men at the feed store whispered that divorce had broken something in her. But 3 months later, when the sky turned black at 2 p.m. and the power grid died in a shower of blue sparks, Mara finally understood why her body had been screaming at her. The thing everyone mocked was not a symptom. It was a warning. And before that night was over, the ugliest house in the valley would become the only warm place for miles. It began on a Wednesday in late August, when the air over northern Idaho felt too heavy to breathe. Mara stood barefoot in the gravel driveway of her cabin outside Coldwater Hollow, wiping sweat from her neck with the bottom of her shirt. The thermometer nailed beside her porch read 91 degrees. Behind her, a flatbed truck groaned under a load of split tamarack. The driver, a red-faced man named Lyle Corman, climbed down and stared at the stacked wall of wood already covering one side of the cabin. "Mara," he said, looking at the delivery slip, "this makes 9 cords in 2 weeks. You planning to heat the whole mountain?" "Just drop it by the north wall," she said. Lyle squinted at the cloudless blue sky. "You know it's August, right?" Mara looked at the empty stretch of wall beside her kitchen window. Her stomach clenched as if she were staring into a hole. "I know." That was the worst part. She knew how it looked. She knew the town was talking. She knew she had used the last of the money from the divorce settlement, then emptied a savings account she had spent 15 years building. But every time she tried to stop, her body revolted. It had started with the dreams. Not nightmares exactly. There were no monsters, no faces, no voices from the dead. Just cold. Cold so violent it felt alive. She would wake with her jaw aching, her hands locked into fists, her lungs burning as if she had been breathing through ice. The first time, she blamed stress. The divorce from Aaron had dragged through the courts for almost a year. Moving alone into a cabin at the edge of a national forest was supposed to quiet her mind, not turn it against her. But then came the impulse, not a thought, an order. Seal the walls. Store heat. You are out of time. At first she tried to out-reason it. She made tea. She walked the road at dawn. She searched every weather report she could find. The winter forecast was mild. The long-range outlook called for rain, not snow. The local stations were still warning about fire danger and drought. But the pressure in her chest did not care about forecasts. By early September, her spare bedroom was gone. The bed vanished under wool bales from a sheep farm outside Sandpoint. Her closet filled with rolled wool batting from a textile warehouse that was shutting down. The hallway narrowed as she leaned folded military surplus blankets against the walls. The cabin began to smell like a barn after rain. Lanolin, dust, hay, animal warmth trapped in fiber. Mara hated it. And still, she kept buying more. Eli Sutter, who owned the feed and hardware store in town, watched her load 6 rolls of builder's wool insulation and 2 boxes of thermal socks into her truck one Friday afternoon. "You sure you're all right?" Eli asked quietly. Mara forced a smile. "Just getting ahead of winter." He glanced through the front window at the sun flashing off the dusty street. Winter's not in a hurry this year, but Mara was. By October, people had stopped making jokes to her face. That was how she knew the jokes had turned into concern. Her older sister, Nina, drove up from Spokane without warning on a bright Saturday morning. Mara saw the car slow at the end of the driveway, then stop completely. Nina stepped out, holding a paper bag of groceries. Her smile disappeared when she saw the cabin. Firewood rose 8 feet along the walls, stacked tight under tarps and lashed with rope against the autumn wind. Bales of raw wool were visible through the front window, pale and swollen, like something alive pressing against the glass. "Mara?" Nina called. Mara opened the door. She had slept maybe 3 hours. Bits of fleece clung to her sleeves and hair. Nina walked inside and stopped in the living room. The couch had been dragged into the center of the room. Wool sacks stood along the exterior walls. Thick blankets hung over 2 windows, even though the day outside was warm and gold. "Oh my God," Nina whispered. "How much did this cost?" Mara crossed her arms. "That's not what matters." "It is exactly what matters." Nina turned on her. "You are hoarding animal fiber in your living room. You have firewood stacked against your siding. You smell like a sheep barn. What is happening to you?" "I'm preparing." "For what?" Mara opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because there was no answer that would sound sane. "For the cold in my bones, for the pressure behind my ribs, for the thing that wakes me up every night and tells me the house has holes in it." Nina's voice softened, which somehow hurt worse than anger. "This is Aaron," she said. "This is the divorce. You're trying to build a wall because he made you feel unsafe." Mara shook her head. "No. You spent your settlement money, didn't you?" Mara looked away. Nina put a hand over her mouth. "I'm calling someone." "No." "Mara, this is not a quirky prepper phase. This is a crisis." Mara's eyes burned. "I know how it looks," she said, "but if I stop, something terrible happens." "What happens?" Mara stared at the wool packed around the windows. "I freeze." Nina left crying before lunch. That afternoon, Calrow walked his old cattle dog past the fence and stopped to admire the disaster. Cal was a retired power company engineer, a man who believed every problem had either a schematic or a receipt. He leaned on the gate and looked at the towers of wood. "You know that's how you rot a wall," he said. Mara did not answer. "And if one spark lands wrong, you've built yourself a funeral pyre." "It's temporary." Cal chuckled. "For a winter they say won't show up?" He pointed up the hill toward his own house, half hidden among pines. "I put in propane heat, a backup generator, and 2 new battery banks. If the lines go down, I'll be fine. You, on the other hand, are one mouse nest away from losing your insurance." Mara almost laughed. Almost. That night she sat alone in the living room, surrounded by wool and shame. Her bank balance was $26. Her sister thought she needed psychiatric help. Her neighbors were counting her woodpile like evidence. And for the first time, Mara wondered if they were right. She pressed both hands to her face and whispered, "Please tell me why." The cabin did not answer. Only the wool pressed against the walls. Only the firewood waited outside. Only the cold, somewhere far beyond the mountains, kept coming. The first sign arrived on the Monday before Thanksgiving. Not snow, silence. No birds in the pines, no trucks on the logging road, no wind moving through the dry grass. The valley held its breath. At noon, the weather app on Mara's phone said 58 degrees and cloudy. The TV meteorologist laughed through a segment about the easiest Thanksgiving travel week in years. He wore rolled-up sleeves and pointed at a map full of pale green. No major winter systems in sight, he said. Maybe some rain by the weekend, but nothing serious. Mara watched him with a bowl of oatmeal cooling in her hands. For weeks, the pressure in her body had become almost unbearable. She had stopped sleeping in the bedroom and moved to the living room, where the wool made the room feel smaller, safer. At 2:07 p.m., the light changed. Not dimmed, changed. The kitchen turned the color of old bruises. Mara stood so fast, the bowl slid from her lap and shattered. Outside the window, above the western ridge, a wall of cloud rolled down from the mountains. It was not gray. It was purple-black, folded and churning, moving too quickly for weather that was supposed to be harmless. Then the house snapped. Every window flexed inward at once. The pressure hit her ears like a dive underwater. Her phone screamed. The alert tone tore through the cabin so loud she nearly dropped it. Extreme weather emergency. Shelter immediately. Catastrophic temperature drop in progress. Do not travel. Mara read the words twice. Then the power went out. Not a flicker, a hard, total death. The refrigerator hum vanished. The heat pump clicked once and went silent. Down in the valley, blue-white flashes pulsed behind the trees as transformers blew one after another. The wind struck a second later. It hit the cabin like a moving train. A pine cracked somewhere outside with a sound like a rifle shot. Snow slammed sideways against the windows, so dense that the world disappeared in less than a minute. Mara grabbed the battery weather radio from the mantel and turned the dial with shaking hands. Static hissed, then a broken voice cut through. Rapid Arctic air intrusion, pressure collapse, regional grid failure. Temperatures falling at a rate not previously recorded in this corridor. She looked at the old analog thermometer by the back door. 1 hour earlier, it had read 58. Now it read 17. As she watched, the needle kept dropping. That was when the fear left her, not because she was safe, because the waiting was over. Mara moved like a machine. She dragged the wool bales into the living room and tore them open with a utility knife. Raw fleece spilled out in thick, oily clumps. She shoved it into window seams, door cracks, and gaps along the baseboards. She pressed it against glass and nailed wool blankets over the frames, sealing out the light. She abandoned the bedrooms, abandoned the kitchen, abandoned everything except the living room and the fireplace. The instinct that had ruined her life now arranged it in brutal order. Small space, thick walls, fire. She pulled open the side door and nearly lost it to the wind. The wood stacked against the house, the same wood Cal had mocked, was close enough to grab without stepping fully outside. She hauled in armloads of tamarack and birch until snow coated the hallway and her fingers screamed inside her gloves. By 4:30, darkness had swallowed the valley. By 5, the fireplace was alive. The first flames crawled through dry kindling, then caught the split tamarack with a deep orange roar. Heat rolled into the room. The raw fleece along the walls absorbed the sound of the storm and held the heat near the floor, then against Mara's body, then around her face. The weather radio crackled again. Outside readings between -29 and -34. Wind chills estimated between -60 and -70 in exposed areas. Mara sat on the floor in front of the fire, sweating through her shirt. The living room was 76 degrees. Beyond the wool, beyond the wood, beyond the sealed windows, the valley was becoming a freezer with no door. For the first time in months, she laughed. A short, broken laugh that turned into tears. She was not crazy. She was not safe either, but she was alive. Then the knocking started. At first she thought it was a loose shutter. 3 dull thuds under the storm. Then again. Thud, thud, thud. Mara froze. The sound came from the front door. She took the flashlight and moved down the hallway. Away from the fire, the house was already below freezing. Her breath smoked in front of her. Frost feathered the inside of the wall around the doorframe. She pressed her ear to the wood. A voice scraped through. "Mara, please." She pulled the deadbolt. The wind ripped the door out of her hand and slammed it into the wall. Cal Rowe fell forward onto the threshold. His beard was crusted white. His eyelashes were frozen. Ice plated the shoulders of his coat like glass armor. His face had the waxy, blank look of someone whose body had begun to lose the argument. Mara grabbed him under the arms and dragged him inside. He was heavier than he looked. The door fought her with the force of the storm. She threw her shoulder into it, screaming until the latch finally caught. Then she hauled Cal down the hallway, inch by inch, into the living room. The heat hit him, and he made a sound that was not speech. Mara wrapped him in wool blankets and pulled off his gloves. His fingers were stiff and pale. He shivered so hard his teeth cracked together. "My generator," he stammered. "Fuel line froze. Battery bank shut down. Roof over the shed went. Propane regulator iced over." He looked around the room. At the fleece packed 3 feet deep against the walls. At the blankets nailed across the windows. At the fire chewing through the wood he had called a hazard. His eyes filled. "You knew." Mara fed another log onto the flames. "No," she said. "I listened." The next hours were worse than the storm. Cal's shivering slowed, and that terrified her. Mara had read enough during her sleepless weeks to know what that meant. Violent shivering was the body fighting. Quiet was the body losing. "Stay with me," she said, slapping his cheek lightly. "Tell me about the substation. Tell me why the grid failed." Cal blinked at her, unfocused. "Too fast," he whispered. "Temperature dropped too fast. Equipment wasn't rated. Lines, ice load, relays tripped." His wet clothes were stealing heat from him. Mara cut away the outer layer with scissors from the sewing basket. She pulled off his soaked flannel and packed raw wool directly against his chest and back before wrapping him again. The fleece was ugly. It smelled sour and animal, but it worked. The crimped fibers trapped air. The natural lanolin resisted moisture. Even when the wool felt damp at the surface, it held heat against skin like a second living hide. Slowly, Cal's shivering came back. Then his color. At midnight, the fire had turned the living room into a strange little furnace. Mara had to crack sweat from her upper lip while frost crept across the hallway floor 10 feet away. Cal stared at the walls. "In a standard wall," he rasped, "you get maybe R13, R15 if it's decent. What you made here," he swallowed, "you made a thermos." Mara looked around at the filthy wool, at the blackened fireplace brick, at the tarps rolled under the door. "I made a mess." You made a shelter. The storm did not care. At 3:40 a.m., the firewood inside was almost gone. Mara counted 7 logs, then 5, then 3. The outside stack was beside the side door, less than 4 feet away, but the temperature had dropped to -31, and the wind was still screaming over the ridge. Cal tried to sit up. You can't open it. If the fire dies, we die. If you open it too long, we die faster. Mara looked at the flames shrinking under the grate. Then I won't be long. The side door was frozen shut. Condensation from inside had seeped into the frame and locked into a black ridge of ice. Mara took the iron fireplace poker and smashed at the seam until her wrists throbbed. Metal rang against metal. Chips flew into her face. After 10 minutes, the latch moved. She tied a tow rope around her waist and handed the other end to Cal. Count to 20, she said. If I'm not back, pull. Mara, count. She pushed the door open. Cold exploded into the hall. It was not air, it was impact. It punched the breath out of her and filled the house with white powder. Her exposed cheek burned instantly, then went numb. Mara dropped to her knees, one hand on the doorframe, the other reaching into the whiteout. Her gloves hit stacked wood. She dragged in 2 logs, then 2 more. The wind drove needles of ice under her hood. Her lungs refused to open. Somewhere behind her, Cal's voice shook through the storm. 16, 17. Mara grabbed one last armload and threw it into the hallway. Then she pulled. The door would not move. The wind pinned it open. She planted both boots against the frame and leaned back with the rope cutting into her waist. For one horrible second, nothing happened. Then the door slammed shut so hard the whole wall jumped. Mara collapsed on the floor, coughing without sound. Cal dragged himself to her and pulled the logs away from her legs. They fed the fire like feeding an animal that might turn on them. For the next 2 days, they lived inside the wool room. They slept in shifts, never more than 90 minutes. They melted snow in a soup pot on the coals. They ate cold beans, canned peaches, and the last 2 packets of instant noodles. Every few hours, Mara checked the wall seams and repacked fleece where the wind had found a weakness. Cal, still weak, became her engineer again. Move that bale, he said once, pointing with a trembling hand. Cold bridge behind it. Mara shoved the wool into place. The temperature near the floor rose 4 degrees. Outside, Coldwater Hollow disappeared. The radio brought fragments. Roads closed, multiple transmission lines down, emergency shelters opening in town. Search and rescue delayed by whiteout conditions. People warned not to leave their homes. As if homes were still enough. By Thursday evening, the worst of the wind finally moved east. The silence after it was almost frightening. Mara pulled a corner of wool away from one window and looked out. Snow covered the glass halfway up. The remaining world was blue-white and broken. Pines lay snapped across the road. Cal's house on the hill was barely visible through the drifts, one dark triangle of roof exposed like wreckage in an ocean. Cal stood behind her, wrapped in blankets. "My place is gone," he said quietly. Mara did not correct him. By Friday, they had warmth but almost no food. By Saturday night, they split the last can of soup. By Sunday morning, the firewood inside had dwindled to a few split pieces, and the outside stack was buried under a drift so hard it rang under the poker. Mara was prying at the side door when she heard it. A thin mechanical whine. Then another. Snowmobiles. She ran to the front door and beat the iron poker against it. Here, she screamed. We're in here. Cal joined her, pounding the wall with both fists. Outside, Deputy Luis Reyes of Boundary Search and Rescue stopped his sled at the edge of Mara's property. His team had been moving house to house since dawn, skimming over buried fences and abandoned vehicles. They had already marked 3 cabins for recovery. No smoke, no heat signature, no answer. Then Reyes saw Mara's cabin. At first, it looked insane. A low building, almost swallowed by wood piles and snow, with tarps frozen into hard blue sheets and wool pressed against the inside of every window. Then he saw the chimney. A thin line of smoke rose straight into the cold morning. Reyes lifted his hand. "Live structure!" 3 rescuers dug through the front drift with avalanche shovels. 10 minutes later, daylight cut into Mara's hallway. When the door opened, Reyes stepped inside and stopped. The hallway was freezing. Then he reached the living room. Heat hit his face. A real fire burned in the hearth. Bales of raw wool lined the walls like the inside of a nest. Mara stood soot-covered and hollow-eyed in the center of it. Cal sat wrapped in blankets near the flames, alive because the woman he had mocked had built the thing he did not believe in. Reyes looked around slowly. "I've been doing mountain rescue for 18 years, he said. "I have never seen a house fight back against cold like this." Mara tried to answer, but her throat closed. Reyes handed her a satellite phone. "Anyone you need to call?" Mara dialed Nina from memory. The phone rang once, twice. Then her sister's voice broke open. "Mara?" Mara closed her eyes. "I'm here." Nina sobbed so hard she could not speak. Mara looked at the wool, the firewood, the filthy blankets, the ugly walls that had held the line. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I had enough." 2 days later, in the high school gym where the county had set up cots under fluorescent lights, a local reporter found her. Mara sat with Cal beside her, both wrapped in Red Cross blankets, both holding paper cups of coffee that tasted like smoke and metal and life. The reporter asked the question everyone wanted answered. "How did you know?" Mara looked past the camera. She thought of the dreams, the shame, the empty bank account, the look on her sister's face, the men at the feed store going quiet when she walked in. She thought of the first flame taking hold while the valley froze around her. Then she smiled a tired, almost embarrassed smile. "I didn't know," she said. She looked down at her hands, still scratched from ice and wool. "I just stopped arguing with the warning."